Hi, my name is Mike, and today I'm going to go over the process of adding a minigame and a boss encounter to my game. I'm a new developer working on my first release, TurtleRun. I have a playable demo up on Steam right now where you can try out the first 4 levels, including one minigame and one boss encounter. And if you enjoy that, give it a wishlist. Right, I'm currently finalizing the second zone of my game, which is a beach zone, and it's time to add the final level. I'm ending every zone with a minigame that you play to increase your bonus damage, followed by a boss encounter. The last minigame uses cards, so this time I wanted to use dice. I decided on some very simple rules based on a game called Pig. The player gets to roll the dice 6 times, with the value they roll being added to their score. If the player rolls a 1, however, game ends and the score they have so far is used. The final score is then divided by 6 to give the player their bonus for the boss encounter. They can choose to continue with this score and take on the boss, or try again for a better score. I also decided that the boss for this zone should be a whale, but more on that later. Just a heads up, this is also the first time I've coded with just boxes instead of focusing on the art first, and for me at least it's so much more productive just to zone in on the code and focus on that at first. If you find yourself constantly switching between coding and art, at the detriment of your productivity, I highly suggest just focusing on one at first. But obviously it's all about the individual and finding what works for you. So yeah, things do look a bit smelly during the development, but if you stick around till the end of the video, you'll see the whole process and see how things turn out in the end. I started by creating a dice game object to hold the values such as the score and the number of rolls, as well as creating the dice object. I then created a dice object with a very basic sprite that, on collision with a player, selects a random number between 1 and 6 and rounds that up to the nearest whole number, as well as incrementing the current turn. Then I wanted to add the game ended functionality, which occurs when all rolls are over or the player rolls a 1. I added a simple function to take the score so far and divide it by 6 to give the player their bonus damage modifier. I also created a variable called bust value and a boolean to hold whether we're bust or not, along with a small function to compare the most recent roll to the bust value. Meaning, if I ever decide to move away from strictly busting on a 1 and let the player choose their own bust number, the code is dynamic enough to handle that without having to update multiple different parts of the application. It's important to predefine values as well, rather than repeating yourself multiple times throughout the code, as it makes it much easier to maintain when you do make a change. I know that's obvious for us programmers, but not everyone in the game dev scene is a programmer by nature, and it's an important thing to remember. I then had the very basic functionality of the game working. Next, I added code to create my room restarter object that I added during the first minigame, and this gives the player the option to continue with their current bonus or try again for a better one. Now I had to decide whether or not to spend time polishing this feature up, adding a proper animated dice that lands on the correct face based on the value, as well as some delays in the jumps to give it some feel, or just crack on with the boss encounter. The old hyper-focus versus distractions debate. I decided to focus up and just get this finished before moving on. I wasn't entirely sure how I was going to approach making it look and feel nice, and I knew the boss was going to be a mammoth task, especially the art, specifically the animations. So off to Asaprite I went to get me some dice. I threw together a dice, an animation for the dice being rolled, and a basic sprite for each of the 6 values that the dice can land on. And that was it. I now had a somewhat functional dice game that the player can keep on trying until they get a bonus damage modifier that they're happy with before proceeding to the boss encounter. I then started having those intrusive thoughts, wondering if this was even fun or if it was just silly, but we'll see. Off to the boss. Super quick, if you're wondering how I got started in the indie game dev journey, I made a video about that last week, which you can check out here. I started with a bunch of notes on how I want the boss fight to work. Essentially just the moves he has, the states he has, and the things that control switching him between his different states. I created a beautiful sprite for the boss object and got to work. Oh, and I quickly added some smack talk to the boss, as that's just part of TurtleRun. Then it was time to program the main combat phase of the boss. During this phase, the boss is immune to regular damage, but can be damaged only by parried bullets. I'll have to tweak the numbers for the shock cooldown and the bullet speed to make it fair but fun. So we've got our boss doing things, but we need some special moves that they can use on cooldown. We've got Big Slam, Tail Slap, and Big Egg. I've already broken these down during the planning, so let's see how well we can implement them. The first 2 definitely seem the hardest, so I picked one of those to get started with. Big slam it is! I thought this would be really easy to implement, but I was sorely mistaken. After the big slam, we needed to know what side of the screen the boss lands on and what side of the screen the player lands on. Because this boss collides with the middle of the screen and changes direction, if the boss lands on the same side of the screen as the player, I had to make them move the opposite direction so that they don't corner the player. But I also had to make the boss ignore the middle collision in that case, or we would corner them after we'd collided with the middle. I did this by adding a property that gets set to true when the slam lands if the boss lands on the same side as the player and the player is trapped between the boss and the wall. This property, when true, means that the boss will ignore its middle collision until another horizontal collision has taken place, meaning that they move away from the player and ignore the middle collision until they've bounced off the far wall, in which case the property is reset and middle collisions can occur again as normal.
Okay.
This took far longer than it should have to implement. But it's all part of the process. Next I was telling myself that's probably enough mechanics for the boss. He already has the bullet hell phase and the big slam, and I want the future bosses to have room to get harder and harder. It's a step up from the first boss for sure, and the more I add to this one, the more complex future bosses are going to have to be. I could save some of the planned mechanics like the tail slap for future bosses. Ultimately, I decided to just try and implement the tail slap mechanic as it seemed like a really interesting feature that hopefully wasn't going to be too difficult. To my delight, it was fairly easy to implement. A couple of tail slap properties like the number of shock waves, the time between shock waves, and the shock wave speed combined with a bit of logic, and I was producing shock waves very quickly, in about 10 minutes. In comparison to the 5 hours I was struggling away with the big slam, this was a huge win. I was still toying with whether to use these moves in a cycle or to pick one randomly each time. I really love RNG and wanted to implement as much of it makes sense in the game. I'll be testing to make sure it feels good, but for now I've gone for random moves. After a quick test, I realised that the tail slap shockwave is extremely hard to dodge if you're already mid-jump from the previous combat phase. I needed to add a small pause in the regular combat phase, so that bullets are only fired if there is at least 1 second before moving to the special move phase, and this made things feel a lot smoother. The boss was now cycling between regular comment and a randomly selected special move. Great. Now for the final, and in my head the easiest move to implement, Big Egg. I tried out a few things for the Big Egg, played around with it a bit, but it just wasn't fun. It wasn't cool, and it's a little bit overdone anyway, so I decided to just stick with the other 2 moves that I have, as they're more than sufficient for this encounter. I drew in the health bar, added back in the smack talk, reset the testing values, and set some values for respawning on the opposite side of the room, and boom, basic boss encounter down. Now I just gotta try and make it all look pretty. I just want to make sure the dice game properly leads into the boss fight and gives the correct damage bonus. It looks and feels really good. That was one of the toughest things I've added into the game so far, but it feels really good to play. Now, I don't think I can stall the art anymore, so here we go. I made a quick list of everything I think I'll need and got to work. It did not start off well. But I persevered, and after about 4 hours I had my basic animations for idle, moving, and tail slap. The next day I picked it up again, and after about 2 hours had finished off all of the animations for the whale. I added in some extras for a splashing effect, as well as changing the shockwave, as it was previously called, to look more like water. I reduced the boss's HP for testing, because he's a bit of a bulky boy, and I don't have time for all that, and gave it a quick playthrough from the dice game leading into the boss, and it all felt really good, and I'm happy with it. And there we go. I've completed 2 of the 4 zones for my indie game, and considering I barely knew what an engine was 2 months ago, I'm super happy with how things are going. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. And again, go try out my demo on Steam and drop that wishlist if you like it. Also, if you're interested in becoming a tester, I'm looking for 3 or 4 more people to test out the latest builds while I continue on with development. So if that sounds good to you, drop me an email at the address on my channel. And if you yourself are looking to get started with indie game development, check out the video I made last week here about how I did. Cheers!